right, so welcome back. You guys were here yesterday, right, for your odd classes? All right. I recognize Elijah. Elijah Fitzgerald is here. But I don't recognize the rest of you. Apologies, I know. This is the weird part about the class is that you guys have been in my class for like, 8 months or whatever. But I don't know what you look like. I don't know. I mean, I know your names, but I don't know the faces that match with the names, if that makes any sense. So, if we could just, go around and see who's here, right? Let's start over in the corner over there. Who's back there? That's you.
Oh.
What's your name? Kevin. Very good, Kevin. Thank you. Nakul Patel. Okay. Venkata. Okay. Right here. Juliana Ibarra, right? Okay. Garcia and How You Hey. All right. Very good. Excellent. So, welcome. This is my classroom. Are most of you guys STEM kids? No? A couple of you? Okay. What's up, man? Come on in. Excellent. And then we went around. I'm just getting to know people and matching faces with names. You are Isabella Lee. And back there, Jonathan. Okay, very good. All right. Excellent, guys. Well, welcome to my classroom. Very good. And I am live streaming right now, but it's not on you. It's only on me. So there are some kids that are actually in your class that are watching me do this right now. So today we're talking about how America gets involved in World War II. Now, I gave you kind of a little bit of a spoiler on this because I mentioned to you that the thing that got America into the war was Pearl Harbor. You guys heard of the attack on Pearl Harbor, probably. Have you gotten to that point in the documentary yet? Have they talked about the attack on Pearl Harbor yet in the documentary? Yes, they did? Okay, cool. All right, great. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about, so sometimes when we talk about World War II, and let's see here, maybe I can do this. One second. Sorry, folks, because I have two different computers in my class. So this is the best we get for screen sharing right now, is which is not ideal, evidently. I wonder if I can improve this at all. Well, for right now, it'll have to be this. I may have to come up with another system for those of you that are watching online. But I'm on the World War II PowerPoint, and we're on the slide that says the Pacific Theater of World War II. So as long as you know where we're at. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. When we describe World War II, right, sometimes we refer to World War II as having different theaters, all right? So the one that we've been mostly focusing on is the European theater of the war, talking about what's going on in Europe as the war is being fought. That is Hitler attacking Poland, Hitler attacking France, Belgium, pretty much everywhere. Russia, Britain, that's all European theater stuff. Now we're switching to a whole other theater of the war known as the Pacific Theater, okay? And this one is going to involve mostly America and Japan, but Britain is somewhat involved as well. At least their Navy is. So the Pacific Theater of World War II is really very different from the European theater, and that's because this one's largely fought on the ocean rather than on land. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, here's the Pacific Ocean. This is just ripped from Google Earth from a million years ago. But I want you to just take a look at that, because this is not a doctored image or anything. You can see how massive the Pacific Ocean is. I mean, it's essentially an entire side of the globe if you're really looking at it. And so you have over here on the very tangent of the of the Earth, these yellow lines right here. That's the coast of like Canada, and then Washington, Oregon, California, and then Mexico and like Central America. But then you've got Hawaii over here, right? Those three little dots, if I can point them out right here, that's Hawaii. And then look how far away Japan is still from Hawaii. Now, in this time, in the 1940s, when this is happening, plane technology is not what it is today. I better back up, otherwise that's way too close on my face on the online thing, and I'm not looking that good today. So, when we talk about planes of this time, planes have a hard time reaching Japan from, Hawaii from Japan. And they have limited range because they're still using like old school engines that run on gas and stuff rather than jet engines, which I guess still run on fuel. But anyway, the reason that Japan doesn't attack the American coastline, like let's say Los Angeles or something, is because literally their planes will not reach that far and then be able to fly back. So the closest they could get to attacking America was Hawaii at the time, and the hope was that if they attacked Hawaii, they would be able to take Hawaii, set up a base there, and launch assaults from Hawaii on America. That never happens, fortunately, but Japan nonetheless attacks a naval base at Hawaii, and this is what brings America into the war. There was a famous quote from, I think it was Admiral Yamamoto, who said something to the effect of, I fear that I have awoken the sleeping giant. Meaning, when he attacked America, he was very concerned that when America came into the war, that this would be problematic for Japan in the long run. In the early going, Admiral Yamamoto, who is the head of the Japanese fleet, promised 6 months of victories. And he basically said, I can promise you 6 months of victories. After that, I make no promises. And that ended up being a rather prophetic statement because, no joke, basically exactly 6 months to the day after the attack of Pearl Harbor, so from December 7th, 1941 to May 7th, 1942, is when we see a major turn in the tide of war against Japan. And this comes with a battle known as the Battle of Midway. And we'll talk about Midway when we get there. We're not quite there yet. But if you've ever heard of Midway before, Midway, there's a USS Midway, which is an aircraft carrier that's permanently docked down in San Diego. And you can go and visit it. It's pretty cool. But the Battle of Midway happens somewhere right around here-ish. It's like northwest of Hawaii somewhere. Very small little island. So let's talk about the war in the Pacific. So technically, to be honest with you, a lot of people think of World War II and they think Hitler, they think the Holocaust, they think of the stuff that happens in Europe. But to be honest, World War II technically starts in Asia before it ever started in Europe. Because Japan had already attacked China. And you might remember me telling you the story online a couple months ago about the Kuomintang and the Communist Party in China who were in a civil war with one another. And in the middle of that civil war, Japan came in and started attacking in northern China in an area known as Manchuria, or Manchukuo. And when this happens, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Communist Party and Kuomintang, put their civil war on halt to address the problems that are going on with Japan invading China. So this initial attack was known as the Second Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan, and that's really what kind of starts Japanese involvement in World War II. And then ultimately, it ends, Japan's involvement in World War II ends August 14th, 1945, when they surrendered to the Allied powers. And so, about, 8 years of fighting or something like that. One of the most infamous aspects of the early part of the attack by the Japanese against the Chinese became known as the Rape of Nanking. And this was a 6-week period after the Japanese had captured the city of Nanking, China. And during this time, 250,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers were massacred by the Japanese Imperial Army. And it's horrible crimes against humanity. Over 20,000 women were raped first and then murdered. The Japanese attempted to cover up and destroy any evidence that these war crimes occurred, but they were discovered, and at the end of the war, when the Japanese were defeated, the people that were responsible for this were brought to trial, and I believe they were hanged. And so, but it's a horrible, horrible event in the early going of the Japanese invasion of China. And these, for us, these events, you may never have heard of these events before, right, as a youngster. For us in America, these events didn't get publicized very much. They weren't talked about very much in the early going of history in the years after World War II. These days, the reason that we go out of our way to talk about stuff like this is because in China, people remember this. This is a big deal. This is a huge historical event. Hello there, come on in. And then you are, did you say Ricardo? Ricardo, got it. All right, very good. So the Japanese attempted to cover this up, but they're not going to forget about the history of this. And if anyone has ever seen the movie Ip Man, anyone ever seen the movie Ip Man? Wow, I can't believe you guys haven't seen that movie. It's pretty cool. It's a martial arts movie. It's about Bruce Lee's teacher. You guys know who Bruce Lee is? Martial artist? Yeah? Okay. Bruce Lee was like a famous martial arts movie star back in the 70s. He died of some weird thing. I forget what he died from. But Bruce Lee's master is what this movie's about, and it takes place in China during the Japanese invasion. This movie was only made, 10 years ago, something like that. All right, 10, 12 years ago. But those stories, like this one, the Rape of Nanking, and just in general, the Japanese invasion of China and the brutality, the absolute disregard for human life that took place, are very, very fresh in the minds of Chinese folks in their history. So even though these aren't events that many Americans may know about, trust me, globally, people have not forgotten about these things. So talking a little bit about the war, these are the flags of the nations that became involved in the war in the Pacific. Now, you have the Japanese flag there. Interesting story about the Japanese flag. In fact, let me see if I have this. I'll be right back. Sorry, folks online. Let me see if I can find this. So I used to have these flags hanging all over my house. This flag right here is the Japanese naval flag from World War II, okay? And it's, you can see it's a sun with a bunch of rays coming off the side of it. And this flag was symbolic of Japanese. Here, let me see if I can step over into the camera so that they can see what I'm talking about here. This flag was symbolic of Japanese imperialism, the idea of Japan going and taking over other nations, the same way that the sun stretches out and reaches all areas on Earth. Japan had imperial ambitions to go and take over places, including China, of course. After World War II ended, now what you guys have to understand about Japan is that the Japanese, remember what we talked about when we learned about Japan, which is that Japan had an unusual transformation from being essentially this super isolated, old school, traditional culture, like, you know, samurais and shoguns and things like that, to very rapidly becoming an industrialized nation, one of the most powerful industrialized nations on the planet. And surrender, going back to the warrior code of the Japanese samurais, was simply unacceptable. The Japanese were beyond diehards, and surrender is the most shame a person could bring upon themselves and their entire family. So the Japanese absolutely refused to surrender. They are ultimately, at the end of World War II, though, forced to surrender. They have no other choice but to surrender, and to surrender unconditionally, meaning that they were able to make no demands about their surrender. When they surrendered, as a sign of shame, as a sign of making known that Japan would forever be a peaceful nation, they stripped the rays off of the sun from their flag, and they made the flag like that one up there, which is a sun without rays, symbolizing that Japan would no longer have imperial ambitions to go and take other places over, commit war crimes, and things like that. All right? So kind of an interesting story. And then on the other side, so you've got Japan, you've got the Nazis. I'm not 100% sure which flag the one is on the bottom. But the Japanese and the Nazis are on one side. On the other side, you have that's the Kuomintang flag, the one with the blue and white sun in the corner there. That's the Chinese Kuomintang flag. You have Australia, New Zealand, America. That is the Free French Forces in the middle there, the Free French Forces. The one on the right is another British holding, like British Malaya or something like that. And then you have, obviously, Great Britain, and then the Netherlands, and then the Chinese Communist Party flag. And I'm sorry, that's the Soviet Union flag. Okay, so moving on. So the attack on Pearl Harbor is what formally gets America involved in World War II. This happens December 7th, 1941. In the documentary, you may have seen the speech that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, by the way, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is the namesake of the high school, obviously, okay? But FDR made a speech after this attack on Pearl Harbor. And in this speech, he said, "This is a day that will live in infamy," okay? A day that will live in infamy. Do you guys know the difference between fame and infamy? What is it? Exactly. So if you couldn't hear what he said, if you're famous, like George Clooney, famous. Brad Pitt, famous. FDR, famous. Al Capone, infamous, right? Who else would be infamous? Like people who are known for doing bad things, right? So when we say a day that will live in infamy, we're talking about it will be remembered for how horrible it was, all right? Hitler declared war on the United States, which was another fatal mistake by Hitler because the United States wasn't focused on what was happening in Europe, okay? They were more focused on the Japanese at this point, but when Hitler declares war on the United States turns right back around and declares war on Germany. And so this can be considered a major mistake by Hitler because he got the U.S.'s attention probably before he needed to get their attention. And so now the United States is going to be focusing their efforts on Europe. So instead of focusing on Japan, the United States, along with Britain, instead focuses on defeating Germany first. All right. So here's the guy that I was telling you about, Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the fleet admiral of the Japanese Navy. And these are some quotes that came from Yamamoto. First quote says, "The U.S. fleet is a dagger pointed at our throat and must be destroyed." You might be asking yourselves, why was Japan interested in attacking the United States in the first place? Why did they have an interest in attacking Pearl Harbor? The reason was that because Japan was allied with Germany in the war, for those of you that don't know much about Japan, Japan is an island, okay, but it's a very mountainous island. And there are not a lot of natural resources on the island of Japan. As such, the Japanese, even to this day, rely very heavily on importing raw materials into their country for people to use and consume. One of the major things that they need to import into Japan is oil, okay? Gas and oil. And the Japanese had been blockaded by the Americans and the British during the early going of the war, which was putting a strain on the supply of oil and gas that Japan had. And this was really threatening to them because they had their own ambitions. And so one of the main reasons that Japan wants to attack the United States is because they feel threatened by this blockade that had been imposed against them that had been starving them of oil and gas. And then the next quote up here, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." That was that quote I was telling you about earlier. So Yamamoto, during discussions on the planned Pearl Harbor attack that they were coming up with when he said those comments, here are some, and now you saw in the documentary actual footage. Remember that when you watch those episodes of the documentary, and you're going to watch another one today for episode 5, you are going to see actual footage of that day. Now, I'll talk to you about a thing. This is I don't know if this is true or not, but some historians have speculated that the attack on Pearl Harbor may have been known before it happened to the United States. The reason that some people think this is that on the morning, Pearl Harbor happens on a Sunday morning. Okay, Sunday mornings in the military, particularly in this day and age, are pretty sacred because people go to church on Sundays, you know, and so Sunday mornings are usually kind of left for servicemen. If there's no other emergencies or whatever, usually Sunday mornings are left for servicemen to attend church, sleep in a little bit, whatever. The attack happened on a Sunday, and on that particular Sunday morning, early in the morning, for no apparent reason, there were a bunch of drills ordered. One drill sent aircraft, the most important ships that America had were aircraft carriers, okay? They sent those aircraft carriers out from Pearl Harbor into the ocean so that they would not be nearby when the attack happened. The other side of it was that they ordered the hangars, which contained all of the planes that the Americans had. they ordered the hangars to put the planes out to the airfields, presumably for drills or whatever. But this is unusual because that means that, number one, the most important ships were gone, and number two, there were a bunch of older aircraft sitting like sitting ducks, laying out in front of the entire Japanese Air Force, who came in after flying off of aircraft carriers themselves, most likely, so that the damage would be enough. The thing what's the word that I'm looking for? The conspiracy theory that I'm talking about here states that if not FDR, high-ranking military officials had some idea that the Japanese were planning an attack that morning. And because FDR needed an incident that would have been big enough to sway the American population to support getting involved in World War II, some people think that that America may have been complicit in allowing the damage to be made larger than it could have been because of putting these airplanes out and so on. Now, do I know if that's true or not? No. It may all just be bad luck. We don't know, but some people have speculated that that perhaps Pearl Harbor, not that it was an inside job per se, but that the damage of Pearl Harbor could have been curtailed were it not for these peculiar drills that they launched on that Sunday morning. So here you have Japan. This line, that red line, signifies basically the war front. Okay, so the amount of territories that Japan controls into the Pacific Ocean. All right, and so you can see here. Here's where the Battle of Midway took place. I told you it was just a little bit northwest of where Hawaii is. Interesting story about the Battle of Midway. Not so much the Battle of Midway, but the island, the Midway Islands. So those islands are still there. You know, no one lives on them, but they're these islands that are just sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that once upon a time World War II was being fought on. So you can go on, like, let's say Google Earth, but not that I've ever done this before, but you can go on Google Earth and you can like zoom into Midway Island and drop the little guy on there and walk around abandoned Midway Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and see like old rusted out anti-aircraft guns just sitting on the shore. And like the whole island of Midway, by the way, has been completely taken over by birds. There's about 1 billion birds that live on the island of Midway today. I forget what kind of bird they are. I think they're like storks or something like that. Some weird kind of bird. But the whole thing is overrun by birds. Everything is covered in bird poop. But anyway, that's another kind of weird story about Midway. But so this is where we're talking about in the terms of the Pacific theater in World War II. Now you can see here Hong Kong. Okay, there are two attacks actually. We always remember Pearl Harbor because that's the one where the American air base was. But there was another attack the very same day, or the following day, December 8th, in Hong Kong, which at the time, Hong Kong was controlled by Britain. I don't know if you remember me telling you about this, but do you remember when I told you about the Opium Wars? Britain was fighting against Japan to continue trading, China. They were fighting against China to continue trading opium into China, and everybody was like becoming addicted to opium. They fought a war over that. And in that war, the end of that war resulted in a treaty that gave Hong Kong over to Britain. So Hong Kong is essentially a British port all the way up until I was in like 7th or 8th grade, all right, for a long time. And so these are the two attacks that happened at that time. The Japanese, you guys know, yourselves probably, the Japanese are extremely technologically advanced. These days, when you think about reliable cars, probably the first brands that come into your mind are going to be Japanese cars. Toyota, Honda, right? Super reliable vehicles. This plane up here, the A6M Zero fighter, the Japanese Zero fighter as they're sometimes called, was the fastest fighter plane in World War II, and it was made by Mitsubishi, which is still a company today, right? They have dive bombing planes. They have torpedo bombing planes. So these are planes that fly, they drop torpedoes, and then those torpedoes will go straight into the hull of a ship. Extremely advanced technology. And here you can see the after effects of the bombing on Pearl Harbor. There are a number of ships right there in the harbor. You can see them, the USS Nevada, the USS Arizona, and so on and so forth, sitting there, okay, right in open, out in the open in the harbor, and they made for very easy targets for these Japanese pilots who were outstanding pilots. The Japanese were very, very, very good pilots. And you can see here some of the planes that got damaged that were sitting on the airfield. Here's another image. They say, has anyone in here been to Hawaii before? Yeah? Did you go visit Pearl Harbor while you were there? You did? Yeah. They say that, so those ships, when a ship sinks, kind of interesting fact, when a ship sinks, there's a certain historical naval respect where you kind of like you don't disturb a grave, right? When somebody's buried, it's considered pretty bad to go and disturb someone's grave. Similar idea. When a ship sinks, it's the most respectful thing is you just leave it there. So the USS Arizona is still sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. They didn't go and remove it. And they say that, there's still oil leaking out from the USS Arizona. You can see air bubbles come up every so often from the ship sitting at the bottom of the harbor. And, the men who were on the ship are obviously down there as well, right? Kind of an interesting fact. All right, here you can see, this is kind of cool photograph. It may be difficult to see from where you're sitting, though. But if you were to come in and look closely at this, you can see the actual, this is an aerial shot. While the attack was happening, you can see the planes flying and attacking in this image here. So it's kind of a cool photo. Here is the reaction from Winston Churchill after Pearl Harbor happens. Winston Churchill says, "Being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful." Why would this be his reaction after this horrible attack on Pearl Harbor against America? Why do you suppose he said that? Bingo. Yeah, now Winston Churchill has an ally. He knows that FDR is going to come in with the American military on his side. And so remember, for the last 2 years, it's been the British, basically the British and somewhat the Soviets, protecting themselves against the onslaught of Hitler's blitzkrieg. So now the Americans are joining in the war, and this is where we see the formation of the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance in World War II is formed in 1942 with Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and 24 other countries. The Lend-Lease planes continue to be shipped over, so the Americans are shipping planes over through the Lend-Lease program. Here you can see the limit of the Japanese advance as the war in the Pacific gets underway. America and Britain and the Netherlands down there have stations in those regions in in Asia, okay, or in the Pacific before the war even started. So they are in danger zones right there because the Japanese basically control all those territories. So these American, British, and Dutch forces that are in those regions right there are going to be in a major danger zone. So they very quickly, you can see here where America is. It's on the Philippines. The Philippines, there was an American base on the Philippines, and the Japanese very rapidly took that over. They surrounded them, and they captured 70,000 U.S. and Filipino prisoners of war and force-marched them to a prisoner of war camp. And this became known as the Bataan Death March. So from the southern end of the Bataan Peninsula, which is where we're talking about, that's how it gets the name, is the Bataan Peninsula, the starving and ill-treated prisoners were force-marched 63 miles to a prison camp. And here you can see where I'm talking about here. Here was the Bataan Peninsula. They get captured at a city called Corregidor, and then they are marched all the way around here down to the prisoner of war camp, which ended up being about 63 miles. The prisoners, the American and Filipino prisoners, were starved as they marched. If they fell ill, they were used as bayonet practice targets. The Japanese had no respect for them because they had surrendered. And remember, the Japanese surrender is the most dishonorable thing a person can do. You fight until the death. And only 54,000 of the 70,000 that were captured lived to reach the camp. Up to 10,000 died on the way, and others escaped into the jungle. And in 1946, the Japanese commander of the Bataan Death March was convicted by a U.S. military commission and executed. But the Bataan Death March, they would, you know what a bayonet is? When I say bayonet practice, do you know even what that is? A bayonet is a knife that you put on the end of a gun. And so they would, like, if they fell ill, they would just go up and start stabbing them with the bayonet at the end of the knife, in case you didn't know what a bayonet was, okay? It was pretty horrible, okay, pretty horrible. You can see the ruthlessness of the Japanese during World War II. And there's a lot of both racism and hatred of Japanese people during this time. I probably don't have to tell you about this. Maybe you've ever heard of the Japanese internment camps here they were in California. Maybe you've ever heard of a story called Farewell to Manzanar. Anyone ever heard of these things before? Oh, kids, you've heard of it. Nice job. Yeah, you can go up and visit where these internment camps were. Now, we have to be honest, they're not like the death camps that the Nazis had for Jewish folks, okay? It's not quite that bad, but it's still pretty bad, okay? These were American Japanese people. Most of them spoke English, okay? And they were taken from their homes and put into these camps here in California by the command of the president, right? Because of how suspicious people were of Japanese folks at this time. So they put them in camps. Now, again, it's I don't mean to make it sound like they were gassing them or anything like. It's not like they weren't committing genocide against them, but it's still super racist and it's still completely inappropriate. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind about this. Over 70,000 American and Filipino soldiers are taken prisoner by the Japanese after surrendering. This was considered a disgrace by the Japanese Code of War, and the prisoners were treated without mercy. And here you can see American soldiers being made to carry their own dead. So these are bodies of fallen comrades that they were taking back to the death camp to give them proper burial. All right, so you can see how there's more territories in red on this map now. All the territories in red are the areas that Japan now controls. And you can see the limit of the Japanese advance still on that red line out in the ocean here. They haven't quite captured Hawaii yet, but they're definitely within striking distance, as they proved with Pearl Harbor. All right, and the next area that we're looking at is where that little target just popped up there. It's called the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then the Battle of Midway. And so we're going to talk about a few different things here. By April, this is now about 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. By April, the first U.S. airstrikes had hit the Japanese home islands. We had not had a single counterattack on the Japanese until April 18th, 1942. Now, this became known as the Doolittle Air Raid, which ends up being an ironic name because, to be honest with you, it doesn't do very much. This air raid does very little. So when we call it the Doolittle Air Raid, it's an oddly appropriate name for it, but that's not why they call it that. The reason they called it the Doolittle Air Raid is because of the commander, the air commander, in charge of the mission was a guy named Jimmy Doolittle. And Jimmy Doolittle, the air raid is named after him. But this was, even though it doesn't do much from a military perspective, even though it's not super effective in like destroying Japanese forces or anything, it nonetheless is a major moral boost for the American troops, because it demonstrated for the first time that the Japanese could be attacked using American planes. So this provided a huge morale boost, and a lot of Americans were like, when are we going to have some victories against the Japanese in this war after Pearl Harbor? They'd been waiting months to get some revenge. And this was the first time that we had been able to reach out and actually hit Japan with some airplane bombings. But it's mostly a propaganda victory. No major targets were destroyed. Here you can see the image of Jimmy Doolittle, who is the second one here standing in front. That's Jimmy Doolittle, and then that's his air crew behind him there. And they are standing in front of a particular kind of plane that Americans used very often in World War II called a B-25 bomber. And there are several different kinds of bombers that the Americans use. There's a B-25 bomber, there's a B-29 bomber, there's a B-52 bomber. There's all sorts of different kind of bombers, but this one was the B-25 that they used there. And now we finally get to the Battle of the Coral Sea. This is May 7th, 8th. Oh, I guess this is about 5 months after Pearl Harbor. Okay, so yeah, I guess I did my counting wrong. January, February, March, April, May. Yeah. Okay, so 5 months after Pearl Harbor. And the Battle of the Coral Sea, here you can see in this image, U.S. Navy aircraft carrier USS Lexington explodes on May 8th, 1942, several hours after being damaged by a Japanese carrier air attack, meaning that Japanese aircraft carriers sent planes over. Those planes found USS Lexington, and they bombed it from the air. This was the first time in military history that two aircraft carriers engaged each other. The ships never even fired on one another. Planes were used for the entire battle. First time that ever happened in military history. And this is an interesting battle because on one hand, it's a tactical victory for the Japanese because they, in terms of the numbers of ships that were sunk, the Japanese did more damage to our fleet in the Battle of the Coral Sea, including sinking one of our aircraft carriers, which we only had at the time 4 of them. So now we're down to 3. So basically, by sinking the USS Lexington, they immediately chopped off 25% of our aircraft carriers. All right. However, on the other hand, this is the Battle of Coral Sea. The reason it's interesting is because it can be viewed as a strategic victory for the U.S. because the Japanese had to turn back for the first time ever in the war. They did not make it to their objective. So even though they did more damage to the American fleet, tactically, strategically, the Americans were not able to or the Americans prevented the Japanese from making it to Port Moresby. And the U.S. were able to keep hold of New Guinea, and it made it easier for future battles to be carried out. And that is the bell, folks. So that does it for me, but thanks so much for coming in today. Nice to meet you all in person for the first time. And I'll be assigning the next episode of the documentary for this afternoon. Have a great day. What's that?
The math building?
The math building?
Yeah.
Is it the C building? Sometimes classes aren't always in here. Let me